The Caro-Kann defense is a very common response to pawn e4. It belongs to the family of semi-open games, alongside the Sicilian and the French. Compared to those openings, the Caro-Kann is usually more solid but less dynamic, often leading to good endgames for black, thanks to a healthier pawn structure. You respond pawn d4, and black immediately plays pawn d5. Here, I recommend pawn e5, entering the advance variation. Bishop to f5, and I recommend pawn to h4, known as the Tal variation. The most natural-looking reply, pawn e6, is actually a blunder. You win the bishop after pawn g4, and soon the bishop will be trapped. For example, bishop e4, you answer pawn f3. If the bishop retreats to g6, then pawn h5, and now the bishop has nowhere to go. Take notice though, black sometimes tries a trick here. They play bishop b4 check. When this happens, simply block with pawn c3. If black captures your knight, do not panic. Just take their dark squared bishop, and now the light squared bishop is completely trapped. And with that, you win a piece and gains a winning position. After the usual sequence pawn to e4, pawn to c6, pawn to d4, pawn to d5, and pawn to e5. Black develops bishop to f5, and you immediately play pawn to h4, the Tal variation. Here black has two choices, pawn to h6 or pawn to h5. Let's start with pawn to h6. You push forward with pawn to g4. Black retreats the bishop, and you push again with pawn to h5. As soon as the bishop lands on h7, play pawn to e6, sacrificing this pawn to trap the dark squared bishop and the rook for the rest of the game. Black takes the pawn. You continue with bishop to d3, offering a trade. Remember, if black declines, you trade the bishops anyway. Most of the time black captures your bishop, and you recapture. Now you have a check that black cannot stop, and you will use this check to make sure black's king cannot castle. Black usually plays queen to d6, with the idea of pushing pawn to e5 to free the position. You cannot allow that. So you play pawn to f4, dominating the e5 square and completely choking black's position. Black develops the knight to d7, preparing to castle, and this is your signal to give a check so the king cannot castle. King to d8. Now you develop knight to f3, ready to jump into e5 and create a monster knight. Black responds with knight g to f6, and you immediately play knight to e5, threatening a family fork. Most players will not allow that and choose to trade. You must recapture with the f-pawn, forking the queen and the knight. If black gives a check, just block with pawn to c3. You are winning. Here, the best move is queen to c7. Now this is an important warning. You must not take the knight, because after queen to g3 check, black can force a draw. Instead, you play knight to c3, controlling e4 and preventing the knight from jumping there. Black activates the rook to c8, and you continue calmly with bishop to e3. Only now is it safe to capture the knight. The queen check no longer works because the bishop blocks it. Black retreats the knight to d7. Now you do not rush to take the e6 pawn with the queen. You play knight to e2, planning to take that pawn with the knight and deliver mate. Queen to b6 opens a way for the king to escape while simultaneously threatening the b-pawn. You jump in with knight to f4. King to c7, and you castle kingside. King to b8, queen takes pawn. Rook to d8, knight to g6, prompting rook to h7. At this moment, you might be thinking queen to g1 wins the rook immediately, and you would be right. But that is not the best way. If you give this position to Magnus Carlsen, he would choose rook to d3. Why? Because the rook is not going anywhere. You can take it whenever you want. And also, you dislike your opponent. So instead of rushing to win, you choose the painful way, grinding black down slowly, piece by piece. Look at the position. The pawns cannot move. The rooks cannot move. The bishop cannot move. The knight cannot move. Only the king, the queen, and 2 pawns have legal moves. Now, whatever black does, this rook on d3 is coming for the king. Black tries pawn to c5, offering a queen trade to neutralize your attack. It doesn't matter. You take the queen. Now black has 2 ways to recapture. If knight takes queen, then pawn takes c5. Knight to c4, and you answer with pawn to e6, again trapping the dark squared bishop and the rook forever. After knight takes bishop, rook takes bishop. Pawn to d4, rook to f3, and the bishop is doomed. King to c7, you double rooks, now ready to capture the bishop. Black tries king to c6. You take the bishop, black trades rooks, rook takes rook. Black takes your c5 pawn, trying to go after your e6 pawn. You stop this with rook to d8. King to c6, knight takes e7 check. King to c7, rook to d7 check. King to b6, and you put the knight back to g6, making sure black's rook is frozen forever again. Black continues king to c6. Rook takes d4, king to c5, pawn to c3, pawn to b6. And finally pawn to e7, winning easily. If instead black plays knight to d7, you take the d-pawn. Pawn to e6, and you sacrifice the rook by capturing the knight. After rook recaptures, knight takes bishop, and you win the game. Let's go back. In the event black takes back with the pawn. You push e6 again, attacking the knight and trapping the bishop and the rook as usual. Black responds with knight to f6. You give check with the bishop. After king to c8, the rook on d3 finally enters the attack with rook to a3, threatening mate in 1. Black is forced to block the dark squared diagonal with rook to d6, allowing the king to escape. You continue with rook to a8 check, king to c7. Then rook takes bishop. You are up a piece, but you do not stop. After knight takes g4, you take e7, once again threatening mate. Black tries pawn to b5, but pawn takes c5, threatening mate again. Pawn to b6, and pawn to c6. The king will not survive. After black plays pawn to h6 and pawn to g4, we see in theory 1 that black wastes time retreating the bishop to g6, allowing white to push h5, attack the bishop, and gain space. Here, black does not retreat the bishop to g6 as in the previous theory. Instead, black immediately places the bishop on h7. This is the signal to push the infamous sacrifice, pawn to e6. Pawn takes e6, bishop to d3. Bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop. Queen goes to d6. Pawn to f4. Knight to d7, preparing to castle. Now is the right moment to give a check. King to d8. At this point, if you blindly follows the theory 1 and plays knight to f3, this does not work here. Black plays pawn to e5, offering a queen trade and freeing the position. Your best continuation is pawn to h5. Now, black cannot play pawn to e5. Because after pawn takes e5, queen takes queen, and pawn takes queen, the kingside minor pieces are trapped on their starting squares. Black is then forced to play pawn to e6 in order to develop. Now the e6 pawn becomes a clear target. Knight to e2. This knight is ready to target the e6 pawn. Black plays pawn to c5, and the best reply is rook to h5, defending the e5 pawn. Pawn takes d4. Knight takes d4, attacking the e6 pawn. Defending this pawn with the king is a positional mistake because it blocks the development of bishop and knight. That is why black chooses to defend the pawn with the knight. You continue with pawn to b4, knight to e4. Here, do not take the e6 pawn yet. Play knight to d2 instead. Bishop takes b4. Rook to b1. Bishop takes knight check. Bishop takes bishop. Pawn to b6. And only now do you take the e6 pawn, check. King to d7. Knight takes g7. You are up a pawn and have two dangerous passed pawns. The game continues with knight to e7. Pawn to e6 check. King to d6. Bishop to b4 check. Knight to c5. Knight to f5 check. King takes e6. Bishop takes knight. Pawn takes bishop. Pawn to g7. Rook to h7 is the best black can do. But you crush black with rook to b7. Knight takes f5. Pawn promotes to queen, check. Rook takes queen. Pawn takes knight check. King to f6. Rook takes rook. You are up a full rook and the game is completely winning. Black's modern approach here is to retreat the bishop to d7, effectively steering the game into the French advanced structure. Against this setup, you develop the dark squared bishop to e3. If black tries queen to b6, you simply develop the knight to d2. After queen takes b2, put the rook on b1, hitting the queen. The queen then grabs the a2 pawn, and now your objective is to trap it. First, rook to a1, forcing the queen back to b2. Then knight to b3, cutting off the escape. After queen check on c3, bishop to d2 forces the queen back once again. Now, the move you must remember is rook to h3, controlling c3 so the bishop can trap the queen. Black continues with pawn to e6, bishop to c3, and the queen is completely trapped. Even bishop to b4 fails to save the queen, because bishop takes bishop, and the bishop soon returns to c3, sealing the trap. Black's best continuation here is pawn to e6. You develop the knight to c3. Queen to b6 attacks b2 and prepares c5. You shut this down with knight to a4. Queen to a5 check, pawn to c3. Knight to e7, pawn to h5 grabs space and denies kingside squares for the knight. Knight to a6, pawn to b4 hits the queen, queen retreats to c7. Pawn to f4 reinforces the center. Black pushes pawn to b5, hitting the knight, but you ignore it and develop the kingside knight to f3. After pawn takes knight, bishop takes knight, and black's queenside structure is damaged. The h-pawn is now under pressure by your queen, but do not take it. Capturing it would allow a discovered attack on your queen. Rook to b8, pawn to a3 strengthens the structure. Knight retreats to c8, and queen to c2. Bishop to e7 prepares castling, but pawn to g5. Pawn takes g5, pawn takes g5, and knight to b6. Pawn to g6 keeps the pressure. Pawn to f5 tries to shut down the attack, but do not take, en passant, because the queen would give check. Instead, you castle queenside. Knight to c4 jumps in, but you eliminate it right away. Pawn takes bishop, pawn to h6 continues the attack. Pawn takes h6, bishop takes h6. King to d8 tries to escape. Bishop to g5, rook takes rook, and rook recaptures. Bishop takes bishop check, and knight takes bishop. King to c8, pawn to g7, king to b7, and rook to h8. This position is absolutely winning. Now let's see how Grandmaster Tamaz Gelishvili demonstrates how easy it is to crush black once they play pawn to h6, exactly as we have already learned. The game begins with pawn to e4, pawn to c6, pawn to d4, pawn to d5, and pawn to e5. Black develops bishop to f5, and white immediately plays pawn to h4. Black responds with pawn to h6. White continues with pawn to g4. After bishop to e4, pawn goes to f3. The bishop retreats to g6, pawn to h5, and the bishop lands on h7. Now you already know the rule. As soon as the light-squared bishop lands on h7, you must play pawn to e6. Black captures the pawn. White develops bishop to d3. Black trades bishops, and the queen recaptures, ready to check the king at the right moment. Black plays queen to d6, preparing to push pawn to e5 on the next move. Gelashvili does not allow this. Pawn goes to f4, completely controlling the e5 square and choking black's position. Black develops knight to f6, hitting the g-pawn. Gelashvili ignores the threat and calmly continues. Knight goes to f3. If black dares to capture the g-pawn, white wins immediately after queen to g6 check. Back in the game, black chooses knight to d7, preparing to castle. Queen goes to g6 check. The king steps to d8. Knight jumps to e5, threatening a family fork. And black resigns. In this model game, international master Richard Biolek dismantles the Caro Kann defense in just 20 moves. e4, c6, d4, d5, e5, bishop f5, h4, h6, and pawn to g4. Black counterattacks with bishop to e4. Biolek responds aggressively with pawn to f3. Bishop retreats to h7, and now comes the critical move. Pawn to e6. Most players would capture this pawn. But here, black does not. Black chooses the best continuation, queen to d6. This is the move you must respect if black refuses to take the poisonous pawn. Biolek grabs the f-pawn with check. King recaptures, preparing to push pawn to e5 and free the position. Biolek does not allow this. Pawn to f4 closes the center and choking black's position. Black develops the kingside knight. Knight to f3 deliberately offers the g-pawn. Black accepts. And Biolek calmly continues with pawn to h5, gaining space on the kingside. Knight retreats to f6. Knight to e5 check. King steps back to g8. Now black's light squares are extremely weak. So, Biolek offers a bishop trade to eliminate the light-squared bishop and magnify the advantage. Black refuses and plays knight to e4. Knight to d2. Pawn to e6 finally frees the dark-squared bishop. Knight to g6 attacks the rook and forces black to give up the light-squared bishop. Pawn takes bishop. Black continues with knight takes knight. Bishop takes knight. Bishop to e7 follows. Now Biolek activates the queen to g4. Bishop to f6. Castle queenside. This deliberately sacrifices the d4 pawn. If black captures it, rook to e1 shatters the position. There is no way to defend the e-pawn without collapse. For example, pawn to e5 leads to mate in 3. Queen check, queen blocks, queen check again, queen blocks again, and queen takes queen, checkmate. So black declines the pawn and plays knight to d7. This is a fatal mistake. The queen is tied to the defense of the e6 pawn. It cannot abandon it, or the king is checkmated in 2. Seeing this, Biolek uses a simple idea: harass the queen. Bishop to b4. Black resigns. If the bishop is taken, queen takes pawn with check, the king moves, and mate follows. Blocking the attack only delays the inevitable. Pawn takes pawn. Queen retreats. Pawn to c6. Queen retreats again. Pawn takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Now the light-squared bishop springs to life. Queen to c8. But rook takes pawn, threatening to attack the queen again. Pawn takes rook. Bishop to d7, a double threat. Black is completely lost. Black's most popular response here is actually pawn to h5. Against this, I recommend the rarely played knight to e2. By playing this move, you confuse black players and drag them out of their theory. Black's best continuation is pawn to e6. You continue with knight to g3, putting pressure on the bishop and attacking the h-pawn. The best continuation for black is to retreat the bishop to g6. But before that, let's see what happens if black chooses pawn to g6 instead. Your best answer is knight takes bishop. Now black has two ways to recapture. Recapturing with the e-pawn is a mistake because it weakens the pawn on d5. Thus, you unleash pressure on the d5 pawn with pawn to c4. Remember, do not take that pawn immediately. Just apply pressure. You only take it if you are sure that black can recapture only with the c-pawn. After bishop to b4 check, you block with the knight. Black continues with knight to e7. As you can see, you still cannot take the pawn because black can recapture either with the knight or the queen. So you continue with bishop to g5, pinning the knight. This bishop will later become your key attacker in the attack against black's king. Black castles kingside. Now it is the right moment to take the d-pawn, because black can no longer recapture with the knight or the queen. Black recaptures with the pawn. You continue with bishop to e2, knight b to c6, you castle kingside, and black plays rook to c8. Now you unleash the attack with bishop takes h5. Pawn takes bishop, then bishop to f6. Black plays queen to d7. Queen takes h5 now threatens checkmate. After knight to g6, queen to h6 appears, and the king will be checkmated on the next move. Recapturing with the g-pawn is the best for black. You continue with knight to d2. Black responds with pawn to c5. You answer with pawn to c3, and after knight to c6, continue with bishop to b5. Black plays queen to b6. You exchange with bishop takes knight check, queen takes bishop. Then you castle kingside, and black castles queenside. Now you capture on c5. Black recaptures. Knight to b3 follows. Black retreats the bishop to b6. You play bishop to g5. Black responds with rook to d7. Now you push pawn to a4, and after pawn to a6, continue with pawn to a5. Black retreats the bishop to a7. Knight to d4 follows, hitting the queen. Capturing the knight here is not good for black, because after pawn takes bishop, the c-file opens for the rook. If black plays queen to c4, then pawn to b3. In case the queen takes on c3, you win after rook to c1. Queen to c7 is best for black. You continue with pawn to b4. Black plays knight to e7, and you keep pushing pawn to b5, threatening a fork. If black captures the knight, pawn takes bishop, now threatening a royal skewer. Pawn takes pawn, thinking that after rook to c1 they would simply block the attack with the knight. This does not work, because you would not rush to put your rook on c1. Instead, you first capture the knight, rook takes bishop, and only then you skewer the queen and the king. In this position, black may play pawn takes pawn. This is the most natural move. After you play knight takes b5, attacking the queen, black plays queen to c5. Here, your best continuation is queen to a4, preparing pawn to a6 on the next move. Black retreats the bishop to b8. Pawn to a6 follows, and after pawn takes a6, queen takes a6 check. The king goes to d8. Knight to d6 appears, and black captures it with the bishop. Pawn takes bishop. If black plays rook takes d6, queen to a8 check, forces queen to c8. Then queen takes queen check, king takes queen, rook to a8 check, king to d7, rook takes rook, and you are winning. If black captures the pawn on d6 with the queen, queen to a8 check forces king to c7. Rook to a7 check, then king to b6. Rook to b1 check, king to c5. Rook to a5 check, king to c4. Rook to a4 check, king to d3. Rook to d4 check, king takes c3. Queen to a1 check, king to c2, and finally queen to b2 is checkmate. Now let's see what happens after bishop goes to g6. You should continue with bishop to e2, adding another attacker to the h5 pawn. Black cannot defend this pawn, so black is most likely to choose one of two moves, bishop to e7, or the more accurate pawn to c5. Let us start with bishop to e7, counterattacking the pawn on h4. You capture the h5 pawn with the bishop, threatening a bishop trade and long-term damage to the king side. Black captures back, and knight recaptures, immediately hitting the g-pawn. Black pushes pawn to g6, and the knight retreats to f4. If black captures the h4 pawn with the bishop, you respond with pawn to g3. Black retreats the bishop to f6, and you activate the queen to f3. Rook takes rook, you recapture with the queen, and bishop retreats to g7. You bring the queen to h7, forcing the king to f8. Now you play pawn to a4. The reason for this move is clear. You want to commit to a rook lift, sending the rook to f3 and aiming directly at the king. Black develops knight to d7, and you lift the rook via a3. Queen to e7, you bring the rook to f3, threatening a royal fork. If black checks, you calmly block with the bishop. Queen grabs the pawn on b2, but the attack now explodes. You sacrifice the knight on g6 with check, forcing the king to e8. Queen captures knight check, bishop blocks, and you eliminate the bishop. After queen takes knight check, king goes to e2. Black captures back on f8, but you crash through with rook takes f7, and the king will soon be checkmated. Back in the game, rook takes h4 is the better continuation, but black still has to be careful. After the rook exchange, black recaptures with the bishop, and you play queen to d3. This is a very dangerous move. If black has no clue and simply develops knight to d7, they fall into a dangerous situation after pawn to g3. Retreating the bishop to g5 is met by the sacrifice knight takes e6. Pawn recaptures, queen takes g6 check, king goes to f8, and bishop takes bishop. You are up 2 pawns. The best choice for black is bishop to e7. But again you sacrifice the knight on e6. Pawn recaptures, queen takes g6 check, king goes to f8, and queen takes e6. Yes, black is up a piece, but in compensation you are up 3 pawns, and all of them are passed pawns. More importantly, the king is now in a terrible position. If black does nothing to protect the king, you will soon push pawn to a4, and the rook will join the attack. So the best continuation for black is queen to e8, a preparatory move to defend the king. You must continue with bishop to h6 check, forcing knight takes bishop. Queen recaptures with check, and after the king goes to g8, you push pawn to f4, and black is in trouble. Black continues with queen to f7. After knight to c3, queen goes to h7, enticing you to fork the king and the knight, while at the same time offering a queen trade and thinking they are winning, since they are up a piece. Do not fork the king and the knight. It's a trap. Simply trade the queens. The king recaptures, and you play king to f2. Rook to h8, rook check, king to g7, rooks are traded. King takes rook, then king to f3. Your strategy is now very simple. You push the passed pawns, force black to give up one of their pieces, and you win. Pawn to c5 is the best choice for black. But you will still win if you know what to do. Here, you should respond with knight to d2, because after black captures on d4, you continue with knight to f3. Black develops knight to c6, and you simply castle. When black develops the knight to h6, you must eliminate this knight. Black recaptures with the rook. Now you play bishop to b5. This is a very important move. After queen to b6, you should retreat the bishop to a4. Black captures on b2. You respond by capturing on d4 with the knight, attacking black's knight. Rook goes to c8, adding a defender to the knight. But you take the knight anyway. Pawn recaptures, then you activate the queen to e2, protecting the e-pawn. Black develops bishop to e7. Now bring the rook to b1, hitting the queen. The queen grabs the pawn on a2, but here black is lost after queen to a6. If rook goes to c7, bishop takes pawn check, wins the game. King to d8 should be met with a queen check. If the king steps onto the light square, as before, you capture on c6 check and win immediately. Blocking the check will not save black either, it only delays the inevitable. You play rook to b7, and once again the position is winning. In fact, with precise play, black will be checkmated in 3. Pawn to e4, pawn to c6, pawn to d4, pawn to d5, and pawn to e5 enters the advanced Caro Kann. In this position, some players, instead of developing the bishop, play pawn to c5, a move designed to confuse you. There is no need to worry. Here we follow the example of international master Eric Gordonneau, who dismantles black in just 14 moves. In his game against Rodriguez Jean-Pierre, Gordonneau immediately captures on c5, going up a pawn. Pawn to e6 follows, as black tries to recover the material. Bishop to e3 protects the pawn. Black continues with queen to c7, hoping to win it back. Queen to d4 firmly protects the extra pawn. Gordonneau's strategy is clear: hold the pawn for as long as possible and only give it back for concrete compensation. Black attacks the queen with the knight, but bishop to b5 pins it. Knight to e7 follows, and knight to f3 reinforces the center. Queen to a5 check forks the king and bishop, but this causes no trouble. Knight to c3 blocks the check while simultaneously protecting the bishop. Bishop to d7, and now the queen is under attack. Gordonneau calmly slides the queen to d2. Deliberately, he allows black to unleash a tactical shot with knight takes e5, finally regaining the pawn, but this is a serious mistake. Gordonneau strikes back immediately by capturing the knight. After bishop takes bishop, pawn to b4 hits the queen. Capturing on b4 fails, since rook to b1 would win the bishop. That is why black chooses queen to a6. Knight takes bishop wins a piece, because if black recaptures, then pawn to a4 pushes the queen back to a6, followed by pawn to b5, trapping the queen. Here, black does not recapture and instead plays rook to c8. But after knight to d6 check, black resigns, seeing that after king to d8, knight takes f7 check wins the rook. In this position, after pawn takes c5, pawn to e6, bishop to e3, queen to c7, queen to d4, knight to c6, bishop to b5, knight to e7, and knight to f3. Instead of giving a queen check as in the earlier model game, black chooses a different move. He jumps with knight to f5, forking the queen and the bishop. In this line, we follow the game of Martin Lamusie. He calmly responds with queen to c3. Black captures the bishop, and pawn takes knight follows. White now has doubled pawns, but he still keeps his extra pawn. Black continues with bishop to d7, and Lamusie castles kingside. Here, black must be careful, because knight takes e5 looks tempting but actually loses. After queen takes knight and queen takes queen, white does not recapture immediately. Instead, bishop takes bishop check forces king takes bishop, and only then knight takes queen wins a piece. In the game, black chooses bishop to e7. La Musique continues with pawn to b4, strengthening the extra pawn. Pawn to a5, bishop takes knight, and bishop recaptures. Then pawn to a3 strengthens the pawn structure. Black castles kingside, knight b to d2. Pawn takes b4, pawn recaptures, then pawn to b6, hitting the c-pawn. Knight to b3 adds protection to the c-pawn. Bishop to b5 hits the rook, and La Musique moves the rook to b1. Now black captures on c5, and knight recaptures. Rook to c8 follows, and rook to a5. Bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop. If black continues with queen takes queen, then after pawn takes queen, black has no time to capture the extra pawn because his bishop is under attack. Bishop to c4, knight to d4, and white maintains his extra pawn. Back to the game, black chooses queen takes rook. La Musique does not recapture immediately. First, he takes the rook on f8 check. King takes rook, then he takes the queen, creating a dangerous passed pawn. Black continues with bishop to a4. Rook to a1, bishop takes c2, rook to c1, and rook to c4. He then pushes his passed pawn to a6. Black tries bishop to e4, offering a rook trade, but La Musique declines. He sends the rook back to a1. Rook to c8 follows, and knight to d4. This knight will come to b5, then to d6. King to e7, knight to b5. King to d7, knight to d6 attacks the rook. Rook to a8, and knight takes f7. White is up a pawn again. Now king to c6 is played, and here comes a very strong move. Pawn to g4, making sure the bishop cannot defend the e6 pawn. Rook to a7, knight to g5, bishop to d3, and knight takes e6 wins another pawn. Black captures the passed pawn, but rook to a5 prepares an attack that would seal the game. Black tries to meet this with king to b6, but rook takes d5. White is now up 2 pawns. Bishop to c8, rook to d6 check. King to a5, and knight to d4. Here black makes a decisive mistake by capturing the g-pawn. La Musique replies with knight to c6 check, and black resigns. The Caro-Kann defense can not only be achieved through the mainstream e4. In recent years, Caro-Kann fanatics have gained more confidence to try it against d4. I remember playing a 2000 rated opponent who answered d4 with c6. Let's be honest, there are d4 players out there who have never heard of the Caro-Kann defense. Here, I gladly continue with e4. After d5, I push e5, entering my favorite Caro-Kann advance. My opponent continues with the usual bishop f5, then h4, the Tal variation. He answers this with the best continuation, h5. I proceed with knight e2. Pawn to e6, and then knight g3, hitting the h-pawn. He defends that pawn with bishop g6, but I add another attacker with bishop e2, and now there is no way for black to defend that pawn. So he resorts to counterattack with bishop e7. I don't care and just grab the pawn. Bishop takes bishop, knight takes bishop, threatening the g7 pawn. He doesn't care and develops his kingside knight to h6, so I grab the pawn with check. King to f8, and then I go back to h5. Black plays bishop takes h4, I answer with bishop takes knight check, prompting the rook to recapture. And then queen g4, hitting the bishop. Black doesn't save the bishop. He plays queen g5, offering a queen trade, but the main purpose of this move is to invade the first rank. I take the bishop with the queen, winning a piece. Black continues with queen c1 check, king to e2, then queen takes b2, attacking my rook, but it doesn't matter because queen d8 is checkmate.